But let's begin now with Sir Robert Buckland, the former Justice Secretary and Conservative MP for South Swindon. Sir Robert, thank you so much for joining us this morning on the programme. I suppose we must kick off with the just astounding news in this Lucy Letby case. The government seems to be unclear on the terms of reference for this inquiry, this promised inquiry. The government's committed to an inquiry, but I was speaking to Nick Gibb just moments ago. He wouldn't say that the government should have full statutory powers to compel witnesses. Why is the government being ambiguous here?
Well, I think that it's really important that any inquiry has the requisite powers to ensure that all material is brought before it and all appropriate witnesses are brought before it. We know that inquiries under the 2005 Act have that power, and it does seem to me in a case like this that in order to establish maximum confidence, then giving the inquiry those powers would, I think, be a wise thing to do. Now, it doesn't need to be necessarily a judge chairing it. I think it needs to be somebody who has experience of the management of a lot of information, could even be somebody with a clinical background, but it's got to be somebody who has independence, a strong reputation, and the ability to make sure that all documents are before them.
I'm trying to think why the government might not be committing at this stage to a statutory inquiry. One argument could be that it's just slower to get off the ground. It would need to be passed perhaps by MPs. That would slow things down. Do you think that might be factoring into their considerations?
Well, statutory inquiries do take a little longer to set up, and if a judge is to be appointed, then the government has to consult with the senior judiciary, in particular the Lord Chief Justice, before, for example, a serving judge or indeed a retired judge can be approached, and therefore these things do take time. But as I've said, I don't think it necessarily needs to be a judge. It needs to be somebody with that requisite experience, and very often somebody, a senior clinician or somebody with a health background could be an appropriate person, as long as they have the ability to manage all the detailed facts and documents in this case, and crucially that ability to summon for documents and witnesses.
It is astonishing that in the last 30 years or so, we've now seen 3 cases within the NHS of healthcare professionals murdering their patients. We saw the angel of death, Beverly Allett, in the early 1990s. We, of course, saw Harold Shipman as well, who was found out and sentenced in the year 2000, I believe. And now, of course, we have Lucy Letby. It seems that there's almost a pattern of behaviour here and lessons that have not been learned.
Well, look, Tom, I think it's really important that we all remember that the vast majority of professionals within the NHS, and indeed everybody working there, do a superb job for us all. And it is tragic and appalling that where one person like Letby and the ones you've mentioned is able to have such of an autonomy, if you like, a control over situations, that then murder and mayhem can ensue. I think from what we're seeing, the emerging reports about this case do reveal that a number of professionals had deep concerns, and there were clearly complaint procedures and a number of processes that were undertaken within the NHS prior to the arrest of Letby, and that it clearly has to be the focus now of the inquiry, to understand precisely what went wrong, why it is that people who were blowing the whistle don't seem to have been properly listened to. And as you say, to get this cultural change that we need, I think, instead of an NHS that is unduly defensive about everything, bearing in mind the risk of litigation and damages, which we know medical negligence, clinical negligence damages are running to the billions of pounds, much more of a sort of black box approach to responsibility, which we see, for example, in the airline industry, where mistakes, where things go wrong, instead of a finger-pointing culture. It's an openness and a belief and a dedication to try and make sure that those mistakes are not repeated again. And I think it's increasingly that approach that we need to foster and encourage in the NHS, supporting clinicians, supporting all our caring staff, but at the same time acting truly in the public interest.
Now, we're hearing from the government that killers will be compelled to attend their sentencing. That's something that we're expecting now in the King's speech in the autumn. But that's several months away. Is there anything that could be done to force Lucy Letby to attend her own sentencing? For, as we understand it right now, she's intent not to.
Well, I know, and I think sadly that the court's hands are tied at the moment. I mean, my suggestion had been to make sure that there was a live link beamed into the cell, either sound or sound and pictures, to ensure that Letby had nowhere to hide and that she, in effect, has to listen to what the judge is saying about the case. And most importantly, the victim personal statements, those impact statements that will really bring home, I think, to the wider world the appalling, devastating impact of the loss of these innocent children, these innocent babies, have had upon dozens of families. That is why I think the government is right to act. There are a couple of options. I hear indeed about proposals for the King's speech in November. There's a bill currently before Parliament, a victims bill. That perhaps could be amended by the government as it goes through the Commons. It's still in the Commons stages. Legislation takes time. You know, Tom, I've dealt with a lot of legislation myself and got it through Parliament. It does take many months. But I'm glad to see that the government is taking the necessary action and trying to strike the balance between stopping, the compulsion of the defendant becoming the centrepiece of attention, but making sure that defendants are being made to face the consequences of their appalling crimes.
I think beaming that sentencing into her cell and perhaps having a camera in that cell sounds like an excellent suggestion. I hope people are listening to those suggestions from you, Sir Robert. But let's move on now to the issue of the ECHR. This is something that dare I say it, is providing a dividing line within the Conservative Party. We hear that a third of Cabinet want out, 2/3 want to stay in. The government itself seems to have this peculiar position that it hasn't made up its mind on this issue until the Rwanda ruling comes back, perhaps not until the end of the year. Your party's in a mess over this.
Look, I think the vast majority of Conservative MPs support our continuing membership of the Convention. It was British Conservative lawyers who wrote it with the express support of Sir Winston Churchill. We should be very proud of our role in being one of the guarantors of peace and freedom and fundamental rights in Europe. This is all about, I think, the not just the history, but the future of our party as well, in making sure that we are outward looking, that we understand the impact that withdrawal would have upon our role in the world and how people perceive the United Kingdom. And I think that leaving the ECHR would be a grave mistake. It's not serious politics, Tom. You know, I still don't follow precisely what leaving the ECHR would do when it comes to things like the Rwanda policy. The Court of Appeal didn't say that sending people to a third country was unlawful or in breach of the ECHR. What they wanted was more evidence that Rwanda was a safe country. Now, we define safe country in domestic law. The Lord Chief Justice thought that the government had provided enough evidence. The other two judges disagreed. That's what the issue boils down to now, and that's what I think we should all be focusing upon. I support the policy, absolutely support it, but I don't think that debates about the ECHR help anybody. It's a massive red herring, and we should move on and focus on what's important when it comes to this vital issue of small boats.
Was it not the case that those individuals who were sitting on that plane, that original plane that was ready to take off to Rwanda, who were then taken off the plane one by one, that was under rulings from the ECHR?
Well, that was an interim order under what's called Rule 39. It's only an interim order. When you look at the terms of the treaty that we signed, the convention, the United Kingdom is bound by final judgments of the court affecting the UK. And you know, Tom, the number of judgments every year involving the UK is tiny. It's on the fingers of one hand, as opposed to, say, Russia, formerly a member, which was being found in breach hundreds of times, as you would expect a regime like Putin's to be found in breach. I really think that there's a world of difference between the Strasbourg court and its role and the role that the Luxembourg court had when we were members of the EU, that clearly had a direct effect upon the applicability of law in the UK. Totally different roles. I think the best way forward for the UK is to continue being a strong voice for further reform. We did it 10 or so years ago by dealing with the backlog of cases. We can do it again. And I think that talk about leaving just diminishes the leading role that our country has played, particularly in light of the importance of unity in the face of Putin's aggression in Ukraine. I can't think of a worse time for an issue like this to be raised. And that's why I think we should put the issue firmly back in the box, focus upon the practicalities, and support the Prime Minister on his initiatives with Albania, and indeed I hope with Turkey and other countries, that I think will really have an effect upon the small boats crisis.
Well, Sir Robert, you certainly have strong views there. There are plenty of your colleagues who would say the opposite. I fear that for your sake, the box may not the issue may well not be put back in that box over the next year or so. We'll continue to follow it, though. And thank you so much for your time this morning on the Camilla Tominey Show. Really appreciate it.